The first feeling that unsettled Steffi was not fear, not even suspicion in its fully formed sense, but a quiet disruption in the pattern of events that refused to align with coincidence, a subtle repetition that began to surface the more she paid attention to it. The more she allowed herself to question what others dismissed as circumstance. Dylan's presence had always been explainable on the surface, justified by timing, by proximity, by reasons that made sense when taken individually. Yet when viewed together, they formed something far more troubling, a rhythm that followed Sheila's movements with unsettling precision. Each time Sheila's hostility toward Taylor intensified, each time her anger found new expression, Dylan appeared, not as a central figure, but as a silent observer, positioned just close enough to witness, yet distant enough to avoid scrutiny. It was this consistency that began to erode Steffi's willingness to accept coincidence, because she understood instinctively that true randomness did not follow such clean, deliberate lines. At first, she tried to dismiss it, not out of naivety, but out of necessity, because acknowledging the possibility of coordination between Dylan and Sheila would mean accepting a level of calculation that extended far beyond anything she had prepared herself to confront. But Steffi was not someone who ignored patterns once she recognized them, and the more she observed, the more the unease sharpened into focus, transforming from vague discomfort into something that demanded action. Her instincts had always been one of her strongest defenses, and now they guided her toward a deeper investigation, one that would move beyond surface interactions into the kind of hidden history that often revealed more than any present behavior could. The discovery that changed everything did not come through confrontation, but through quiet persistence, through a moment that might have passed unnoticed if she had not already been looking for something more. The file was not hidden in a dramatic sense, but it was buried in a way that suggested it was not meant to be easily found. An old record tied to a case that had long been considered closed, its relevance diminished over time. Yet as Steffi examined it, piece by piece, the details began to align in ways that were impossible to ignore, connections emerging not through direct statements, but through subtle overlaps, shared identifiers, fragments of information that, when placed side by side, created a narrative that had never been intended to be seen in full. The reference to a secret birth, handled discreetly, without public record, was the first indication that the past held more than it had revealed. Cases like that were not uncommon in isolation, but what made this one different were the traces that extended beyond it. The faint but undeniable links to both Dylan and Sheila, connections that could not be explained away as coincidence or administrative overlap. The realization did not arrive as a single moment of clarity, but as a gradual tightening of understanding, each new detail reinforcing the last until the conclusion became unavoidable. This was not a series of independent actions, not isolated expressions of personal conflict, but part of something coordinated, something rooted in history, in relationships that had been deliberately concealed. For Steffi, the emotional impact of this realization was complex because it shifted the nature of the threat from something reactive to something strategic. Sheila was no longer acting out of momentary obsession or uncontrolled emotion, but from a position of calculated intent, her actions shaped by a long-term objective that extended beyond immediate confrontation. Taylor, in this context, was not simply a rival, but an obstacle, someone whose presence disrupted a plan that had been in motion for far longer than anyone had realized. The idea that Sheila viewed Taylor not just as competition, but as a barrier to reclaiming influence, both in Deacon's life and within the broader Forrester dynamic, reframed everything, because it suggested that her actions were not just about emotion, but about power. Dylan's role within this emerging structure was even more unsettling, because it introduced a second layer of intention, one that did not align perfectly with Sheila's, but intersected with it in ways that created a dangerous convergence. If Sheila's focus was on removing Taylor, Dylan's appeared to be directed elsewhere, toward Ivy, whose recent proximity to certain truths had placed her in a position of unintended risk. The possibility that Ivy had uncovered something connected to that hidden past, something that threatened to expose the larger scheme, explained the sudden shift in Dylan's behavior, the intensity of her movements, the calculated nature of her interactions. It was no longer just about presence or timing, but about control, about ensuring that certain information remained buried. This duality of purpose created a situation far more volatile than Steffi had initially anticipated, because it meant she was not dealing with a single threat, but with overlapping agendas that could escalate independently or in coordination, depending on circumstance. Sheila's objective to eliminate Taylor and Dylan's intent to silence Ivy were not mutually exclusive, but they operated on different timelines, different triggers, creating a landscape where multiple crises could unfold simultaneously. For Steffi, this realization was not just alarming, but overwhelming, because it placed her in a position where action was required on multiple fronts, each one carrying its own urgency, its own consequences. Her instinct to protect Taylor was immediate and deeply personal, shaped by years of connection, of shared history, of understanding the strength and vulnerability that defined Taylor's role within their lives. But protecting Taylor now required more than physical presence, more than emotional support. It required anticipating a threat that was no longer visible, that operated through manipulation rather than direct confrontation. At the same time, the danger surrounding Ivy demanded attention, because the longer Ivy remained unaware of what she had uncovered, the more exposed she became, the more vulnerable to a situation she did not fully understand. The pressure of navigating these parallel threats began to weigh heavily on Steffi, not because she doubted her ability to act, but because she understood the cost of miscalculation, the potential for one decision to compromise another, for one moment of delay to allow irreversible damage to occur. She could not afford to approach this, as she had previous conflicts, with direct confrontation or reactive measures, because the nature of what she was facing required strategy, required precision, required a willingness to operate within uncertainty. As she began to piece together a response, her actions became more deliberate, more calculated, each step taken with an awareness of the larger structure she was attempting to disrupt. She monitored Dylan more closely, not openly, but through subtle observation, tracking movements, noting changes, identifying patterns that might reveal intention. At the same time, she worked to ensure Taylor's safety, coordinating with those she trusted, reinforcing the boundaries around her, while remaining careful not to reveal the full extent of what she suspected, because premature exposure could trigger the very outcomes she was trying to prevent. Ivy, unaware of the full scope of the danger she faced, continued to operate within the same environment, her recent discoveries pushing her closer to a truth she did not yet fully comprehend. Her curiosity, once an asset, now placed her at risk, because it led her deeper into a network of secrets that had been carefully protected. Steffi recognized this, understood that time was limited, that waiting for certainty could mean losing the opportunity to intervene, and so she began to move toward a confrontation, not one defined by emotion, but by necessity. The tension built steadily, not through explosive events, but through the accumulation of knowledge, the growing awareness that everything was connected, that each action, each decision, was part of a larger design that was now beginning to reveal itself. Sheila remained in the background. Her influence felt more than seen, her presence shaping events without drawing direct attention, confident in the belief that her plan remained intact, that the pieces she had set in motion would continue to move as intended. Dylan, operating with her own sense of urgency, began to act more decisively, her restraint giving way to a need to secure control before the truth could fully surface. For Steffi, the moment of convergence approached with an inevitability she could not ignore, a point where observation would no longer be enough, where action would be required, regardless of the risk. She stood at the intersection of multiple truths, each one carrying the potential to change everything, and the weight of that knowledge settled into her with a clarity that left no room for hesitation. This was no longer about suspicion or possibility, but about certainty, about understanding that what she was facing was not a series of disconnected threats, but a coordinated effort to reshape the balance of power within her world. And in that understanding, she found not fear, but resolve, because if there was one thing she had learned from the legacy she carried, it was that survival in a world defined by manipulation required more than strength. It required the ability to see beyond what was presented, to act before the full picture was revealed, to trust not just in evidence, but in instinct. The battle ahead would not be simple, nor would it be contained, but it was one she could no longer avoid, because the consequences of an action were no longer abstract. They were immediate, they were personal, and they threatened to take everything she was not willing to lose. The moment Steffi chose to act did not feel heroic or decisive in the way such turning points are often imagined, but rather heavy, deliberate, and filled with the awareness that whatever she did next would set into motion consequences she would not be able to control. The knowledge she carried was no longer theoretical, no longer a collection of suspicions waiting to be confirmed, but a dangerous truth that demanded movement, because waiting had become the greatest risk of all. Every second she hesitated gave Sheila more time to close in on Taylor, gave Dylan more opportunity to silence Ivy, and the realization that she was now the only person who understood the full scope of what was happening pressed against her with a suffocating urgency. Her first move was not confrontation, but protection, because instinct told her that Taylor was the most immediate target, the one whose vulnerability had already been exposed through recent events, the one whose removal would serve as the clearest victory for Sheila's long-standing obsession. Steffi tightened the circle around Taylor, not through obvious measures that might alert their enemies, but through subtle shifts, ensuring that Taylor was never alone, that every interaction was observed, that every unexpected presence was questioned. Yet even as she reinforced those boundaries, she understood that it might not be enough, because Sheila did not rely on direct access alone. She operated through manipulation, through infiltration, through methods that bypassed traditional forms of protection. At the same time, Ivy's situation demanded immediate attention, because the danger surrounding her was of a different nature, less visible but no less lethal. Ivy was not yet aware of the role she played in this unfolding conflict, not fully conscious of the truth she had begun to uncover, and that ignorance made her both vulnerable and unpredictable. Steffi saw the risk clearly, understood that if Ivy continued to dig without guidance, she might trigger a response from Dylan before Steffi could intervene. The challenge was not just to warn Ivy, but to do so without exposing the full extent of what she knew, because revealing too much too quickly could destabilize everything, could force their enemies into action before she was ready to counter it. When Steffi finally approached Ivy, the conversation carried an undercurrent of tension that could not be disguised by calm words or measured tone. She spoke carefully, offering fragments rather than the whole, guiding Ivy toward caution without fully explaining why. But Ivy, already unsettled by the inconsistency she had encountered, sensed that something deeper was at play, that Steffi was holding back, and that realization sparked a different kind of urgency within her, one driven not by fear, but by determination to uncover the truth completely. This divergence in approach created a subtle friction between them, because while they shared the same goal, their methods were not aligned, and in a situation this volatile, even small differences could have significant consequences. Meanwhile, Dylan's behavior began to shift in response to the tightening net around her, her movements becoming more deliberate, more controlled, as if she had sensed the change in the environment, the increased scrutiny, the subtle resistance to her previously seamless navigation of events. She did not panic, because panic was not part of her nature, but she adapted, recalibrating her approach, accelerating certain actions while concealing others. The urgency that had once been directed solely at Ivy now expanded, because she recognized that the situation was evolving, that someone was beginning to understand more than they should. Sheila, operating from a different position, remained outwardly composed, her confidence rooted in the belief that her long-term strategy could withstand temporary disruption. Yet even she could not ignore the subtle shifts occurring around her, the way opportunities narrowed, the way resistance began to take form. Her response was not to retreat, but to advance, to push forward with greater intensity, because she understood that hesitation would only allow the balance to tip against her. Taylor's removal remained her primary objective, and she began to move closer to that goal, not through overt action, but through carefully orchestrated circumstances that would isolate Taylor, create vulnerability where none appeared to exist. The convergence of these movements created a tension that built steadily, not through visible conflict, but through the alignment of intentions that were on a collision course. Steffi, aware that time was no longer on her side, made the decision she had been avoiding to bring the truth into the open, not in its entirety, but enough to disrupt the structure that had allowed her enemies to operate undetected. She began to gather what evidence she could, piecing together the fragments she had discovered, preparing to confront not just Dylan or Sheila individually, but the connection between them, the hidden history that bound their actions together. The confrontation, when it came, was not explosive, but charged with a quiet intensity that made it far more dangerous. Steffi did not accuse immediately, did not reveal everything she knew, but she introduced doubt into the space, challenged assumptions, forced reactions that exposed more than direct questions ever could. Dylan's response was measured, controlled, but there were moments, brief and nearly imperceptible, where the mask slipped, where something darker surfaced before being quickly concealed. Sheila, observing from a distance, recognized the shift instantly, understood that the situation had moved beyond containment, that the risk of exposure was no longer theoretical. It was in that moment of instability that everything accelerated. Ivy, acting on her own instincts, moved closer to the truth than anyone had anticipated, uncovering a detail that connected the past to the present in a way that could not be easily dismissed. That discovery placed her directly in the path of danger, triggering the response Dylan had been trying to delay. The attempt to silence Ivy did not come in the form of overt violence, but through a calculated maneuver designed to discredit her, to isolate her, to make her claims appear unreliable before they could gain traction. Steffi, recognizing the move for what it was, shifted her focus, redirecting her efforts to counter it, to protect Ivy not just physically, but reputationally, because in a world where perception shaped reality, losing credibility could be as damaging as any direct attack. The situation became a race, not just against time, but against narrative, against the ability of one side to establish truth before the other could distort it. At the center of it all, Taylor remained both the catalyst and the target, her existence representing the final barrier to Sheila's complete return to influence, her safety now intertwined with every decision Steffi made. The weight of that responsibility settled into Steffi with a clarity that left no room for doubt, because she understood that failure was not an option, not in a situation where the stakes extended beyond individual survival into the very structure of the family she was fighting to protect. As the lines between past and present, truth and deception, intention and reaction continued to blur, one reality became undeniable, that this was no longer a battle that could be contained or controlled, but one that would inevitably erupt into something far more visible, far more destructive. And when that moment came, when everything hidden was forced into the light, the consequences would not simply resolve the conflict, but redefine it, leaving behind a landscape where trust would have to be rebuilt from fragments, and where the cost of every decision